Hey everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, helping you decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Let's decide. Welcome to another minor TBR book review. Today's book is a sapphic fantasy romance tale written by author Lily Gwyn. This book is the first in a series called the Sapphic Orcs of Torden and was published on February 21st, 2023. So, initially, I had no plans to actually make a review of this book. I picked it up for some mushy, fluffy reading between my other books this month of June. Fit the theme, and it seemed good. It wasn't something I was expecting great things from, admittedly, but I wasn't really expecting anything bad either. It was just some light reading for me, clocking in at 224 pages and being a fantasy story about an orc and an elf falling in love. However, as I read this book, there was just so much I wanted to say. I'm not really joking when I said this book literally interrupted my sleep patterns with the kind of emotions it brought on me. And those emotions were almost entirely negative. Now, before we start, I want to give a quick rundown on what happens in the book, just for context. You have a pretty generic plot. An elvish princess of the country Branwen by the name of Elketh is put into an arranged marriage with an orcish princess, Ruga, of the neighboring country named Torden. This arrangement is sprung on Elketh at the last minute, and before the elvish princess is aware of what's going on, she is left in Torden for a 50-day betrothal period where she and Ruga are meant to get to know each other before they eventually return to Branwen to be wed and to take over as the rulers of the country. However, since Elketh didn't agree to this particular arrangement and had issue with her father basically dumping her, she does everything in her power to get sent back before those 50 days are up and sabotage the marriage. But wait, what's this? Is she falling for Ruga? Now, let's go back to my negative emotions. Well, it's mostly one emotion, and it's genuine anger. You see, this book opens with a warning that Elketh, our elvish half of this orc-elf romance, is an unlikable character. Now, when I see warnings like this, it sort of sets off alarm bells in my head. Now, there's a time and place for discussing the concept of trigger warnings at the beginning of the books, such as their advantages, their disadvantages, and whether we should have them at all. And this video isn't either. Specifically, what I mean when I say this is that when I see a warning like this, it makes me worried. Because this tells me that the author knew a character was supposed to like is incredibly unlikable. But instead of simply rewriting their story in a way to reduce that unlikability, they simply slap the warning at the start. This comes off less like a courtesy warning telling us what we're about to be subjected to, and more like an attempt to push off responsibility. Now, if you say you didn't like the character, the author can just shrug and say, well, I warned you they were bad. And I want to say that even with this warning, I was not prepared for just how awful Elketh really got. I mean it when I say for the first half of this book, I genuinely hated this entitled brat of a character. You know how much I complained about Eli Yananakis in my Compound review? Yeah, take that and amplify it by at least double, and you're getting close to how much I hated Elketh. I actually considered putting this book down as a DNF as Elketh continued on, so fed up with her behavior. Legitimately, the only reason I continued was because I decided that I wanted to talk about this book on my channel. And to give some credit, I no longer hated Elketh with the same fiery inferno that I hated her at the beginning of the book, but I would say it only really cooled to an apathetic whatever about a character by the end. Now, when it comes to awful characters, you really want to walk a fine line, especially if you're meant to eventually like them. When you eventually are supposed to like a character, you have to be sure that this character never gets to the point where the audience doesn't even want to see their redemption, which is where I was with Elketh. Take Haymitch Abernathy from the Hunger Games. He's a drunken jerk who seems unconcerned with actually doing his job and training the District 12 tributes with the necessary skills they need to stand a chance against the other districts, to the point that our heroes have to pull a knife on him to actually get him to do his job. When you start the book, he is a jerk, and you really aren't supposed to like him very much. However, a good way to ensure that a character never truly goes beyond the point a reader doesn't want to see them redeemed is to ensure that the reasoning for doing such jerkish actions is understandable. We see that in Haymitch. Haymitch, though a drunken lout, has been deeply traumatized by his own experience within the Hunger Games, being the only surviving winner from District 12 at the time of the story. We know that year after year, no matter what he does, he knows he's sending at least one of these kids to their death, and he'll be expected to do the same next year. You not only understand why he's a drunk, but why he didn't even really want to help them in the first place. He doesn't want to get attached to people he knows at least one of them is going to die, and only agrees when he realizes the 2 tributes this year are actual fighters that aren't going to go down easy. Now, let's look at Elketh. In this book, Elketh almost starts a war between 2 kingdoms by pretending she was kidnapped, relishes in moments when the staff of the castle mess up so she can so viciously attack them that she sends them sobbing back to their kitchens, smashes a ceremonial crown with great cultural significance to the country of Torden, and forces Ruga, the orc half of the romance, to sleep outside for weeks. What's her reasoning? Because she'd rather not wait a month and a half to go home. Yeah, this was the reason I hated Elketh. She does all these awful things because she's an impatient brat. Ruga and Astrid, Ruga's sister and the Queen of Torden, make it very clear to Elketh herself, they walk up to her and tell her that they were under the impression that she had agreed to this arranged marriage, was aware of it before the morning she came over, and flat out tell her that if she doesn't want to go through with this marriage, they will not force her to, and will happily send her back after the 50-day betrothal period is over. In fact, it's her own father who tells her she's not allowed to come back before the 50-day betrothal period is up. Actually, specifically what he tells her is that if she doesn't marry Ruga, she can't come back at all, and he will disown her. But this fatherly abandonment means nothing to Elketh, because clearly it's Torden that's keeping her there. And it's just, she's supposedly a princess and soon to be ruler of her own country, but she doesn't even seem to comprehend the fact that what she's doing is not only stupid, but incredibly damaging politically. Her father said she can't come back. Torden isn't the one keeping her. So when we watch Elketh hurt the people of Torden in a desire to return home, it's like watching a neighbor get disinherited from her mother, coming over, breaking all your windows, demanding that you make her put her mother back in her will. And don't even get me started on this whole crown subplot, and how it only exists to create tension. When it's broken, Ruga hides the act from her sister, who is likely to take the destruction of this important historical artifact of their culture much more seriously than Ruga did. However, apart from hiding it, she doesn't do anything else to mend the situation. She doesn't try to reforge the crown with her own blacksmithing experience. She doesn't try to get her mentor to reforge the crown. She doesn't use her merchant contacts she has from her background to find a convincing forgery. The entire plan for hiding Elketh's impulsive destruction of this important historical artifact is to just hide it and hope the situation goes away. And Elketh never even really suffers any form of consequence from this. In fact, you could argue that she finally gets what she wants. And that's it. At best, the worst thing that happens to her is that her actual chance of romance with Ruga is cut off briefly. But let's get into that. The actual romance aspects of this book go by way too fast, especially with how awful Elketh was to start. It just doesn't work on a number of levels. Even ignoring the fact that Elketh was a legitimate terror in the castle for a long while to literally everyone she came across, especially Ruga, and has at this point destroyed, again, a historical artifact to Torden's culture, an important historical artifact to Torden's culture. Ruga and Elketh go from practically being strangers to sharing a bed in a marital sense in less than 2 days, which arguably could work. Except when you consider both of these characters are part of a race that lived to be at least a millennium. On a comparative scale, this is the equivalent of getting a roommate who spends the first 2 days in your home, smashing their room and screaming at everyone who comes over, you included, because their father made them move out of the house. This includes getting your game console and smashing it against the floor while also laughing at you. But then you two decide to spend an afternoon together having coffee, and you know what? I guess you're in love. It doesn't quite work when you put it side by side, right? Had Elketh been less awful, or had the romantic build-up and Elketh's redemption been stronger, it probably would have been fine. Once you cross the halfway point and Elketh stops being a despicable brat to everyone, the book pretty much mellows out into generic fantasy. It follows a mostly cliche outline. The two grow close, reach a point where they're sure they're going to be happy together, may even go through with the marriage. A dramatic event happens during the height of their emotion, causing one side to rethink the romance altogether. A lack of communication causes the two of them to separate for a time, before the reveal on the side that left causes them to realize how stupid I'm being, and run back to the other side of the romance and confess their undying love no matter the consequences. Typically after being bedraggled after going through hell to get there. Pretty much everything you've seen before, and then a little bit more. So, with the main issue of the romance and the characters being awful, let's talk about some other smaller issues that I have with this book. The world building isn't great, as neither Torden or Branwen are really fleshed out as countries. Apart from some clear Nordic themes in Torden's custom, they're pretty much bland. What few things there are to flesh out the world don't really stick around long, or really only offer a superficial look at the culture. The most I can say is the two kingdoms are designed as opposites, with Torden clearly meant to be seen as the better kingdom when compared to Branwen. Another thing I would have liked is I would have liked to get a little more of an impression on why this alliance between the two countries was so important, considering that Ruga broke off a 2-decade-old relationship to be in it, and Elketh's father threatened to disown his own daughter if she refused to marry Ruga. Just adding some clarity to the stakes involved would have really helped invest me in the outcome, and added some sense of justifications to the actions being taken rather than just, this is what needs to happen to make the story go. The story says it's to solidify an alliance between two countries to ensure warlords at Torden's border can't invade Torden and then eventually Branwen. But considering how little emphasis is placed on it and the lack of worry we see when this is explained, it really doesn't feel like a drastic measure is needed. Like, Ruga has to marry someone from Branwen. And for that matter, neither species feels really fleshed out either. The elves are just elves, and the orcs feel like they were designed for the sole intention of subverting what a standard orc is, which is a fine enough a way to begin creation of a culture, but when that's the only thing you do, it's just as shallow if you had just done the most stereotypical version of the orc. All the unique aspects of the orcs in this world compared to others are the equivalent of cosmetic items you purchase in an MMO shop. For the most part, however, I could have ignored all these. I picked up this book with the intention of reading a fluffy romance, and not a well-fleshed out fantasy epic. But since the romance aspect tanked hard in my opinion, I noticed these flaws a lot more. Personally, I'd give this book a 4 out of 10. Honestly, I was expecting to rate this much lower, around quarter of the way through, but once Elketh mellowed out and the book went back to its more generic romance roots, it evened out. I didn't really hate Elketh by the end anymore, but I certainly didn't like her either. And I still think Ruga would have been better off with pretty much anyone else in the story. Honestly, it wasn't even what Elketh did in the beginning that bothered me so much, but rather why she was doing it. If Gwyn had made a couple small changes, I think Elketh could have come off in a much more sympathetic light, and therefore the story would have been much better. Okay, so she posted this on the Goodreads website about her book, and I read it before I typed this specific section of my script. Specifically, what she said is that she wanted to poke fun at the genre expectations, and thus didn't want Elketh to be an actual captive of the orcs, nor did she want to depict the orcs as haughty or possessive. I don't really know standard romance tropes in fantasy. I don't recall orcs being presented as haughty or possessive, but I'm guessing what she means is the trope of fantasy romance in general rather than orcs. Well, I already mentioned that subversion for the sake of subversion doesn't work. Let me suggest this. Why not have it so Elketh believes that she's a prisoner? Seriously, change this one thing. When the orcs get back the King of Branwen's response saying he'll disown his daughter if she doesn't marry Ruga, why not have Ruga, in a moment of worry, hide this message from Elketh? After all, someone's parent threatening to disown them unless they commit to an arranged marriage that they clearly don't want to be in would be traumatic to many people. However, have Elketh know that her father would have written back. So when she does these awful things like screaming at orc staff in a purposeful attempt to get them to flee from her quarters in tears, or smashes this ancient ceremonial crown, she has the motivation of thinking she's breaking free from people she thinks are a captor. This would have also explained why Ruga seemed like such a doormat to the worst of Elketh's behavior in the beginning. When Elketh destroys something important to her people and her culture, She asks, "How can I make you feel comfortable?" It'll come off less like Ruga has absolutely no backbone against this elvish terror, but rather Ruga realizes the stakes and is trying her best to help an ignorant child from ruining her life. Is this a perfect solution? No, probably not. But it would have at least made a lot of Elketh's actions understandable. She no longer is she's this unsympathetic brat taking out her frustration on innocent people and trying to start wars because she's impatient. But she's someone who genuinely believes that she's being held prisoner. Her actions will make sense, and we as an audience can understand why she is doing this and not necessarily blaming her for doing it, even if we don't think what she's doing is right. In addition, it would give Ruga more personality than the doormat she is at the beginning of the stages. And then kind of the Mary Sue-ishness she embodies later on, but that really didn't bother me all that much. Anyways, but the real question, does this deserve Mount Doom? Yes. Personally, I wouldn't recommend this read to anyone. I found Elketh far too unlikable during the first half, and the second half was pretty much every romance trope you've seen before, but in a poorly defined fantasy setting. The characters don't feel consistent, they often change dynamics and motivations almost on a whim. I never got a sense the world was a genuine one, and most of its events of the plot feel like they happen because that's what the author needed to happen, rather than it being a genuine course of events. And obviously, I do fall outside the target demographic. So there are probably people out there who will see things that I don't. But personally, I just think there are greater sapphic romances out there that you could spend your time on. I've already reviewed a couple by the time this will go out, so I recommend checking those out first. With that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.